right, you had me worried.
There you go. There you go. It is. Good catch. Uh-oh.
I have to zoom in to read that fine print. Good evening. I'd like to call to order the special board meeting for Monday, January 13th. Ms. Schopp, may I get a roll call, please?
Yes. Megan Miller.
Present.
Tom Hankins is unable to join us this evening for personal reasons. Brian Anderson.
Here.
Brian Nichols.
Here.
Amy Levy.
Here.
Greg Schneider,
Present.
and Tia Johnson.
Here.
All members are present except Tom Hankins.
Thank you. May I get an approval of the agenda?
So moved. Second.
Motion by Brian Nichols, seconded by Greg Schneider. Any discussion? Hearing and seeing none. All in favor?
Aye. Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Tonight, we are here to discuss the referendum to share with board members information, scenarios, and potential action for a 2025 April referendum. The background information is that the school district of Beloit faces budgetary constraints leading into the 25-26 school year. These budgetary needs have been expressed throughout the 23-24 school years, leading us to a potential 2025 referendum question. Dr. Garrison?
So the board, just thank you all for the conversations that we've had over the past year, of course, and naturally over last week. Our task today is to really dive right into the conversation as discussed from last week. One of the things that I really want to do real quick was just to give us a real quick recap of Thursday's meeting without going into, major details before we can just kind of land in the conversation for today. The board has 2 sheets that we have uploaded to board docs that you all have readily available for your viewing purposes. The first sheet was the scenarios that came from Thursday. And in that Thursday's conversation, we did hear from the board as it pertains to, some of your thoughts in that whole package of different opportunities there. I'm not going to go over every scenario in the space, but just note that that base scenario from the last week's conversation is still noted. And then, of course, we went through a few other scenarios in that space. Are there any questions about what we talked about in those base scenarios from last week on Thursday? When I say base scenarios, the first set of scenarios. Okay, and so from there, we, of course, heard from the board, took down some notes, and we wanted to provide this second sheet that you all have that was shared in board docs as well as in separate email conversations to you all in reference for tonight's conversation. And just to recap, we did hear from the board that, a stable mill rate would be pretty important. And so what we want to do is try to provide that level of conversation, knowing that, we don't know what number is the best number from a mill rate perspective, but we did want to try to provide different scenarios that would provide that level of stability. The second thing that we heard from the board was that we wanted to, kind of capture the space of should we or should we not lean into more of the overall teacher pay space. Right now in all of our scenarios that you see on last week's agenda was about a 3% increase. And on the one that you all see now, today, the scenario opportunities, we have various different opportunities with salary increases for our staff, okay? So we want to provide that level of detail to you all as well. And thirdly, we realized that the board wanted to fall somewhere between G and H, and if that was a space that we could kind of operate from, which again prompted some of the space that you see in the scenarios today, okay? Again, are all these scenarios perfect? Like I shared before, there's going to be something that's going to be missing in anyone's space because it's, different levels of opinions around what should be added and what shouldn't. However, we did want to make sure that we captured that space based off of your input from last week's meeting. So today, that's our charge, is to kind of hone in on some thoughts that we, want to agree on or come to some form of consensus with. I use that word very kindly because I know this is a hard decision. It's a hard decision for our board. It's a hard decision for our community, naturally, but we really want to make sure that we kind of hone in on some of those thoughts. So firstly, I think we need to come to a level of consensus around 3 years non-recurring operation referendum, 4-year non-recurring operation referendum, and then we can kind of go through the, one could argue the sandwich of the conversation throughout. I do want to keep the conversation as close to, concise so we can kind of move forward through the conversations accordingly. But of course, the board, can dictate how that conversation looks. So I'm gonna turn it over to Mrs. Johnson just to start us off in the conversation first around where are we at with the non-recurring 3 or 4 as a board, and kind of hear from you all where we're landing with that.
Thank you. Mrs. Levy?
Thank you. My preference is to have a 4-year non-reoccurring referendum, and again, to provide that stability. And I think it's really going to be important from an accountability perspective. I really like the idea of tracking a graduating class. So starting with our 9th graders, the year the referendum funds are implemented, and track them through senior year and really identify their growth and the ways that the referendum benefited that class. And then, of course, the accounting of exactly what that money was spent on.
Thank you. Brian Nichols?
I'm more in favor of the 3-year non-recurring. I don't really have any other. I just think that's where we probably need to be for now.
Brian Anderson?
I guess I'd start with my preference would be 3 years based on our, maybe what we've earned to ask for. Could I be convinced 4 years? Maybe, but I'm definitely would be starting at and in favor of 3 years.
Thank you. Megan Miller?
Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Perfect. So I'm like the opposite of Brian Anderson. I'm convincible for 3, but I'm leaning toward 4 for 2 reasons. One, I just want to reiterate everything that Board Member Levy just shared. I think it just sets us out for better accountability and like this is what we spent the dollars on, this is what the results were. The second reason that I'm leaning more toward a 4-year is that if you think about the practicality and the stability of running the district, if we do a 3-year referendum, we've got year 1, year 2, middle of year 2, a lot of our administrative kind of like human capital is going to be focusing on preparing the next referendum, because that is how school funding works, unless something crazy major changes right at the state level for funding. And I would rather have administrative time and resources and expertise spent on producing the results that we hope to gain by passing said referendum. So I'm convincible, but I feel like 4 years is both better for accountability and will produce better results. Thank you.
Thank you. Greg Schneider?
I'm kind of a toss-up between 3 and 4. I think for the district, 4 would give us more stability over a longer period of time and keep us moving, but I also know the concerns of the community with possibly going for 4. So at the moment, as the discussion goes on, I'm okay with either one. Personally, I think I would like to see 4 just for stability.
Thank you, Greg. And Greg, to echo your sentiment, I'm pretty much there with you. I can understand and appreciate the desire to do 4, but also realistically knowing the community and First and foremost, I want a referendum. If we're going to do a referendum, let's get one that's going to pass. My concerns with a 4-year is, although I like what Mrs. Levy has proposed in tracking students, I haven't seen any plans on what specifically will be tracked, who will be doing the tracking. The programming doesn't seem like it's been well vetted yet or flushed out yet on what that would look like. So I'm a little bit concerned with saying let's do 4 and then make it make this happen. So that's where I am. Dr. Garrison?
Okay, so, let me just speak to both of the points of 3 or 4. If it's a 4-year, of course, we will follow whatever strategic plan that we have in place at the time, along with whatever board goals that we set. And so I just want to make sure that that's a notice based off of your statement. Our goal is, of course, to, bring back that data and that information as we process it within the spaces of district goals and or, of course, a strategic plan. Just to let you all know, we still have to report on how we're doing, right, from a year-to-year basis. That's a part of what we have to do, on a year-to-year conversation. And so that's the space that I want to share with you all. And based off of kind of what I'm hearing, I'm not sure if we're landing at a consensus around 3. Well, actually, I do believe we're landing. If Mr. Hankins was here, I don't know what his sentiments would be, but I'm probably leaning towards him being in that 3, and we'll probably be landing in a 3-year non-recurring space based off of just the board's deliberation and conversation. With that being stated, if that's a space that we need to continue the conversation, we are more than willing to do that. But as it stands, based off of kind of what I've taken down here, it looks like the 3-year non-recurring space is where we're kind of landing, and for various reasons. Are there any questions about that at all?
Brian, is your hand up for a question or comment?
No,
Okay.
Oops, I forgot that.
Take it down. Okay, thank you. Okay. Well, as we continue this space, Ms. Johnson, let me proceed. Okay, so the next space that I would like to kind of consider for us is the scenarios again. Now, I know that the scenarios took us the majority of our last conversation. Again, the presentation, as you see it, went through a couple of those presentations from last week. I'm going to pull up the sheet for today. And Mr. Chady, do me a favor and tell me, I want to make sure, let me do this real quick. I'm going to stop sharing and then reshare so I can pull up that other sheet for today for the public. Give me 1 second. Let's present my screen. This one, oh, nope. This one. All right, so I think this is the correct one. Ms. Shay, can you look on the screen up there then? Okay, that's the right one, okay. So for today's conversation, what I wanted to do is kind of walk us through these, not walk us through these scenarios, but you all were able to view this over the weekend. And I wanted to kind of start the conversation around how you're feeling, what you're looking at, what's the space that you're operating from, and allow that to kind of guide how we start to narrow down what we won't probably be looking at, okay? Now, we have to do this, y'all, so it's one of those spaces where, we want to kind of go through some of these more than once. But if there's any questions that we can answer, Mr. Chady is definitely available to help with that. My cabinet will be able to help with that. But I'll turn it back over to Mrs. Johnson for, how do we want to start having these conversations. But before I do that, Mr. Chady, could you do me a huge favor and just give an overview snapshot of this sheet for the group, please?
Yep.
Thank you. 5 minutes, tops.
Yep. So we'll start at the top, the base. Of course, that's if no referendum was provided. Again, we have an approximate $6.2 million deficit for the 25-26 school year. The next row down, scenario G, this is the same scenario G that the board looked at and considered on Thursday with an approximately $6.80 mill rate. And then scenario H at the very bottom is also the same scenario that the board looked at last week, Thursday as well, with an approximate $7.50 mill rate. Kind of surmising the discussion amongst the board thereafter, it sounded like the board may have been looking for something kind of towards the middle, is probably the best way to put it. So Friday morning, we quickly put together, 5 scenarios, labeled scenario I, J, K, L, and M. All of those revolve around the $7.15 mill rate, which was kind of the midpoint of that 680 and 750, although all were a little bit different. So scenario I was essentially scenario G, just increasing it to $7.15 as a mill rate. Retains the same 3% for salary in wages or personnel compensation. Scenario J takes scenario I and adds in an additional $1 million to support any additional staffing, transportation, curricular needs, etc. Scenario K takes scenario J and increases the compensation expenses from 3% to 4%, and then also retains that additional $1 million. Scenario L increases the compensation expenses to 5%. And then scenario M was an idea that I floated last week, Thursday, increasing the compensation to 6% in the first year, and then 4% in years 2 and years 3. So that's how we kind of packaged these scenarios or came up with these ideas. Not to say that any of them is what you have to go with, but hopefully we can find some resonance around one of those, and we can perhaps get some board alignment on that tonight, or I can do some more work between now and tomorrow night.
Are there any board questions or comments on any of the scenarios? Oh, Mr. Anderson?
Mr. Shady, I guess in general, I mean, I do like the idea of a stable mill rate. I think that's just good for everyone. The only question I have of where that would and should land would also need to include what impact a future capital referendum would have, right? So, like, just looking at these scenarios, which thank you for putting them together, you know, somewhere in that 7 to 7.5 mill rate makes sense to me. But if you tell me that a capital referendum's going to move that to 12, now, and I'm sure it wouldn't. I'm just saying
Right.
because it's stretched out longer, and because but I'm saying the impact that we are going to have, are some capital needs at some point. The impact that would have on it. If you were to say, hey, that might raise it, because again, we spent a lot of time right at 10.
Yep.
And that's a very comfortable level, I think. So I'm not opposed to going to 10. But if we're not asking for the capital stuff yet, we need to leave room so that when we ask, we can still be under that number.
Right, and I think we're probably going to be good. Let me, if I can just have a few minutes to talk about the mill rate. So we're seeking stability in the mill rate, much like the district had for a number of years up until the last 4 years or so, which has kind of been the downfall. The numbers that we're looking at, 680, 715, 750, are gross numbers. And I say that intentionally because when we factor out the revenue limit worksheet, we come up with that mill rate at the end. However, that mill rate does not take into any consideration the school levy tax credits that the municipalities apply to property tax bills to essentially buy down that value. And unfortunately, that buy down school levy tax credit amount kind of varies from year to year. The other thing that I'll point out is that the mill rate, there's really two factors that help calculate the mill rate: what the tax levy is and what the total equalized value of the district are. That's different than the assessed value of the district. Total equalized value comes from the Department of Revenue. That's one of those figures that we receive on October 1st. In the budget model, we're anticipating a 2% increase in the equalized value, which is likely less than what it will be. For the number of years back, like the last 5 years, it had averaged anywhere from or not average, but it had been, I think, a 12 or a 16% increase, 7% increase. It's likely to come in stronger than 2% that we're using in the budget model. Always best to err on the low side here, because when it comes in higher, say at 5%, growth in equalized value, then your mill rate's going to drop from 715 to like the 680s. So it's beneficial to us. So when we think about equalized assessed value from Department of Revenue coming in stronger and applying the school levy tax credits, the net impact to property taxpayers would be less, which would provide opportunity then for future capital referendum priorities that may be needed to be addressed down the road. Yes.
Megan Miller?
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Cady. That was a really helpful explanation. Also, thank you so much for your work. All of these scenarios are really exciting. I think they offer, you did a great job reflecting back the conversation from Thursday. So just to kind of in the interest of consensus forming, I would be happy in this realm. I really, really like scenarios M as in Mary and L quite a bit. I think budgeting high to retain teachers is key. When we spoke on Thursday about what our priorities are, there were 3 of them, and 2 of them are entirely reliant on our staff. So I'm really leaning more towards scenarios M and L, but I'm interested to hear what my colleagues have to say as well.
Thank you. Mrs. Levy?
Thank you. Am I looking at this correctly in that scenario H is the only one that would give us the flexibility to bring on new supports for behavior and support at Beloit Memorial?
I would not necessarily state that.
Well, without using the surplus.
The resources that are provided, can certainly be targeted or prioritized to meet certain needs. Scenario H specifically was a request at $750 for a mill rate, and then to support new and additional behavioral support. And I can't recall exactly how many positions that was off the top of my head. And the Beloit Memorial High School transportation, which we're ballparking at $500,000. But those things could be attended to in any of the scenarios, to be honest with you. It's about prioritizing your resources so that you're making sure that you're striving for your goals that we're looking to hit here.
So it's my understanding that the scenarios as presented, and as you beautifully explained in our previous meeting, unless it's had that notation that we could bring in new things or specifically transportation, that those things were not earmarked, so to speak, or we would have to use the surplus in order to make that happen. And I'm not comfortable with using the surplus for something that's not specifically identified and money set aside for, because when we hit that cliff, we're not going to have anything to address it. And if we don't pass a subsequent referendum, like, that feels very bleak to me. So without going into surplus, is scenario H the only one that has those specific items that are listed, like new and additional behavioral supports and the transportation and the additional compensation for staff, and we have some flexibility how we use that? Is scenario H the one that covers all of those items without using the projected surplus, or am I not reading these scenarios correctly?
So, can I jump in? So, Mrs. Levy, great question. Scenario H was a package that we put together that did have the things, those two items input into not having to touch the surplus. So you're correct, scenario H does provide that level of those two support areas. Now, what we also did was we looked at, I'm just gonna go back up to the top of the page. If you look at scenario J, scenario K, we said the 3% across the board, as we've been discussing, with $1 million additional something. Because we didn't want to, dictate what the board wanted to lean in on as pertains to the buckets and the priorities. So we said, like in scenario J, it'll be with $1 million additional of something. Scenario K, same thing. 4%, though, was included in the salaries with $1 million into something. And that's kind of, those are the three areas in which, unless Mr. Taylor, you think I'm saying something wrong, scenarios J, K, thank you. Scenarios J, K, and H provides a level of something that we could do without having to touch the surplus.
Thank you so much for that clarification. And the reason that I asked at our last meeting to have that cushion is that my intention, and I'm just speaking for myself, I want to be clear about that, is for us to have an additional cushion so we can address that cliff if this referendum passes, but the next one does not. And I appreciate the board's understanding of me needing to be flexible today because I have work commitments. So I might have to jump off in a little bit, but I will join you as soon as I can. I can't support, I'm very uncomfortable supporting a referendum that does not have those supports that we discussed, because I see that as part of the visioning that we asked our community and staff to come and share with us what they want our district to look like. So I am in favor of scenario H. I am very uncomfortable with a scenario that does not specifically set aside funding for those additional things that we want, that community members that participated said that they want. Thank you.
Ms. Levy, Ms. Levy, can I ask you a question for clarification?
Please, sir.
So with scenarios, again, that I mentioned, J and scenarios K, I know it doesn't get us to the 5 and nor the 6% that the other board members kind of mentioned as a thought process for our staff. J does provide a level of some surplus and $1 million towards something, as well as scenario K. So would you be amenable to, and I hate to use the word amenable, but would you be amenable to the words to scenarios J and K and H? Because that opens up a little more.
No, because I think 3% is too low. Mm-hmm. If we are making an ask with intentionality of financially supporting our staff, for me, the floor that I am comfortable with is 5%. So currently, scenario H is the only one that I'm comfortable with. But thank you for asking that additional question.
Just to let you know, scenario H is a 3% increase to that to stabilize the mirror rate at 753, 751, and 746. Scenario J is the 4%. I'm sorry. Scenario K is the 4% opportunity for increase in staff pay. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, because I didn't realize it was 3, and then I'm going to zip it because other people have their hand raised, and I want to be respectful of that. If scenario H only includes the 3%, then I can't support that one either. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mrs. Levy. Brian Nichols, I'll give you the floor, and then I would like to ask board members if, what their floor is. Is it 5%? Is it 3%? Or something else?
I think I'm between 4 and 5%, so I'll go for 4, but I could probably be swayed.
You had your hand up. Was there another comment you wanted to make? Oh, okay, thank you. Greg Schneider?
One, I think that the floor, as we start looking at personnel increases, I think would be, for me, would be 5%. Simply because we do need to make up some time that we've lost over the last couple of years. And so we also need to be ready for what's coming in the future. With that said, I think scenario H, if that would incorporate the increase in personnel costs, would be my preference. It's the one that does give us the ability to do what the community has asked us to do, to continue to address increased academic achievement, to continue to support, to work with behavior issues within the buildings, to support all of our students that are there, and to provide some, some other supports to enable our students to be in school, and to be in the classes. So my preference would be to stay with H, but with an increase in the personnel costs.
Megan Miller?
Thank you so much. So yeah, the reason that I didn't say H right off the bat is because I remember it being the 3% from last time. So I just want to echo the comments of the two previous board members, Mrs. Levy and Mr. Schneider. I just want to put out there, I'm open to, I really like, in addition to what was said, the scenario M kind of layout of the staff compensation. I think Mr. Anderson's email last week also had something like that. I like the idea, to Mr. Schneider's point, of putting in kind of a spike right off the bat because we have been so behind. And I think, like, ideally, if we could level out at 5, that would be awesome. I'm open to it leveling out at 4, but I'm curious what it would come out to see scenario H with sort of like a 6%, 5%, 5%, just so we can kind of like see it. But that's kind of my line of thinking. I'm not comfortable throwing out like this is a hard floor. I'm still kind of learning from what other people are saying, but I'm leaning toward as much staff compensation as we can get, and echoing the idea that we have to deliver on what the community has told us that they've wanted.
Mr. Anderson?
Yeah, again, I like the idea of, going as high as even 6% the first year. Scenario M that goes down to 4% on 2 and 3. I think that gives, it doesn't mean it couldn't be 5 or 6%, right? What it means is we're committing to that amount because we're going to spend that from referendum dollars. It doesn't mean if other situations change that we couldn't do, just like we make a decision now of what it's going to be, anywhere from 0 to whatever percent we choose. So I don't think going down to 4 precludes us from giving 5 or 6 in years 2 and 3, but at least it spells out, hey, this is what's budgeted because we got money from the community. So I think, as long as I like the staff compensation at 644. I'm still okay with a mill rate under scenario M if it were to go above the 715, if it went up to that 7.5 and incorporated some other things. That's where I would land.
Brian Nichols?
Thank you. Mr. Chady, let's take M, and if we move that to 544, if I remember your comments last week, we would pick up $1 million as we did in J and K. Is that correct?
Yeah, I believe that would be accurate, yes.
Okay, so, because J and M, with the $1 million additional, that was to use for the transportation and behavioral. Is that correct?
The $1 million additional in J and K, I would say was not earmarked.
Okay,
We used $1 million and,
okay, okay.
we can determine the priority of that after the fact is kind of what I told Dr. Garrison.
Okay, but if we move down to H, what amount did you put in there for additional behavior support and BMHS transportation?
So BMHS transportation is estimated at $500,000.
So the $500,000 for
Yeah.
behavioral?
Well, probably, I think it was more than that, quite honestly. It was over $1 million, and I can't recall the exact value. I'd have to dig out that estimate or that scenario and look into that. With regard to the BMHS transportation, so when we talk about transportation at our middle school level, students need to reside at least 2 miles away from the middle school to be eligible for transportation or reside in a hazardous transportation zone. If we put a 2-mile perimeter circle around Beloit Memorial High School, we're getting way out on the fringes of the district. I don't know if $500,000, I don't know if it'll cost that much. And I think we would need to check with those students to see if they would ride.
Yeah.
So lots of things that we have to think about with regards to that. But yeah, so that was the number that we used.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was just trying to back into something that would maybe be more agreeable to the board.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly, I mean, it sounds to me like we're in that HM area, sinking staff compensation to be higher, perhaps at that 644, 544, 654, whatever, right? I mean, we could do any and all sorts of things.
Right.
And then also provide for some of those additional behavioral supports. Let's just call it some other, right? I mean, does transportation get in there? Not for me to say. Behavioral supports, curricular supports, those types of things, again, not for me to say. But let me see if I could call up scenario H and make some revisions to that here.
Dr. Garrison?
Thank you. So one of the things Mrs. Johnson, would you mind sharing your floor for compensation?
Go ahead.
I need I was writing down the numbers.
Oh.
Yeah. So what was
I'm
your-
sorry.
yeah,
I
that was
thought you
your
meant
question,
the floor.
Sharing the floor. Yeah.
Yes, you have the floor.
Yeah.
I'm with Brian Anderson. I like the 644 as a starting point, and my rationale behind that is, and that's floor. Last board meeting, I remember it was reported out that we had over 50 instructor positions open. We're doing something wrong in recruiting and keeping staff here. And I think it's really important that we pay our staff well We want to keep them here, give them the training they need to be high quality, good educators to our students. And, just over the state line, it's much more competitive. Quite honestly, going a step further, I know in H you've got the BMHS transportation, and I know in the Hadley reports from the feedback from our listening sessions, transportation did come up, but nowhere did I see specifically transportation for high schoolers. Now, personally, I love the idea of having transportation for everyone. If I had a magic wand, I would just have free public transportation, period. But I'm a little concerned right now if it was my decision alone, and I had $500,000 to spend for high school transportation or for teacher pay or for addressing behavior, it'd go to the teacher pay or behaviors before the high school transportation. I don't know, were studies done on the public transportation? Do we know how many other urban school districts provide transportation for their high school students? It was kind of a, yeah, so that's where I am.
And great thoughts there. So just hearing from the board, I'm hearing, and if you just look at the snapshot, 5% is where, just based off of an average, mostly 5% and 6% was the thoughts. And so actually, to be exact, the number was 5.16% if we did an average of where we're landing with teacher pay. Can the board get behind 5% as a starting point, as a number? I just need to make sure, because I want to kind of land in this space because it's going to help us with other spaces. Mr. Nichols, you mentioned your low would be a 4%. Would you be okay with the 5.5%?
Yes.
Mr. Snyder, would you be okay with 5%?
Yes.
Mr. Anderson, would you be okay with 5%?
Yes.
I know Mrs. Levy is Ms. Levy, if you can hear us, it would be great if you can chime in on the 5%.
Yes, my answer is yes.
Thank you so
5 is
much.
fine.
Thank you so much. Mrs. Miller, would you be okay with 5%?
Yes.
Yes, okay, and Mrs. Johnson. Okay, so we're at 5%. That's what we'll kind of land at for now with this scenario. And I think that gives Mrs. Johnson the question around what the floor would be, so we can, kind of continue with the conversation. Is that okay? Thank you. So 5%, Mr. Shady. So we're looking at a 5%, and then the cascading down to 5.44 is what we're looking at. Keep in mind, right now the CPI for next year, according to our conversation last week, was about 3%. It's landing in that area, but we're also wanting to get back where we kind of left off with being able just to do half over the past 3 years since we've been in the conversation. 2 years, 2 or 3 years. So 5% is where we're landing with that. Now, I need to jump us into, just progress the conversation just a little bit into the package space. So we're going to be okay with the 5.44. That's where we're landing. Mr. Snyder? Yes. Yes.
I would advocate that, yes.
Yep. Mrs. Anderson, yep. Okay, cool. So 5.44, Mr. Shady, is kind of what we're looking at with the cascading down conversation. The $1 million package, let me just say this. So and just to piggyback off of Mrs. Johnson's conversation, this gets a little hard, to be honest with y'all. So, naturally we would like to do everything. Okay, board, I think we would love to do everything, but realistically, is that the space where we are going to land? And so what I want to just think about is, if you had to forget about the number, what would be the thing that you want to see in this conversation? And so that's going to help me determine what the number is going to be behind that. That makes sense? So forget about the $1 million or the $1.8 million that it will cost for discipline, and the $1.8 million that it costs for academics, the $1.6 million that it costs for behavior, and the $1.5 million over 3 years that it'll cost for transportation, let's just think about what do you really want to see in that other package space. And since we probably won't all agree to 3, give me your top 2, if you don't mind, so that I can kind of, level set where we're landing in that space. Now, the board could always tell me, Dr. Garrison, back up. We just want to be able to talk about the $1 million in surplus conversations later, but it'll help if we were concise in this space at this point. So, Mrs. Johnson, I'll turn it back over to you to lead that discussion, if you don't mind.
Okay, just so I am clear, you are asking us for our
Thoughts?
top 3 priorities, or what we want to see specifics?
Sure.
Can you clarify a little bit what
Yeah.
you're asking?
So we have our buckets of priorities, and right now we've definitely landed in that we want to pay our staff. So that one is already on the table in the scenario bucket. Okay. The second thing we need to figure out is of the other 3 priorities: transportation, behavior, and academics. Is there a top that you want to see that's going to be included in whatever package we end up building? The $1 million, the $2 million that's going to cost, whatever it is, because that's something that I have to get at if we're going to get to a landing space tonight. So is that clear? Okay, Mr. Anderson, do you mind going first, please?
Yeah, I'll jump in.
I'm sorry, Ms. Johnson. I'll put turn back over.
So I think, with the teacher pay thing settled, the other 2 for me would be the behavioral support, what form that takes, we can talk about, but, and then restoring fund balance. Now, I think we can spend the remaining funds on those discipline and behavioral related issues. And I think if we adhere to the budget, fund balance, if we have 56 positions open every year, that's $4 million that's budgeted, but it's not going to be spent, which inherently then, if it's budgeted and it's accounted for, can return to fund balance each year, which I think would help solve some of Board Member Levy's concern about this cliff. I think we could add to fund balance, not that we need to use it, but what it does is it allows you to make maybe a smaller ask in year 4, or or if it, for some reason, another one wouldn't pass, it's not such a big cliff.
Mr. Snyder, can I jump to you, please?
I mean, the 2 biggest ones that we're hearing from the community are academic achievement and behavior support.
Okay.
So those would be my top 2. Again, increasing the fund balance could possibly be done by cuts in other areas, by carefully using what we have. I mean, that I think is also a critical issue for us. But what the community is saying is academic achievement and behavior support.
Thank you. Mrs. Miller, Mr. Nichols. Sorry.
Just don't call me late for dinner, don't forget. Well, again, I'm going to go back to what I was talking about earlier. So if we look at M, we got 544, and we add $1 million off of this 1% we got, there we are.
Correct, but which areas would you want us to put the money towards?
Yeah. Yes, academic achievement and behavior.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Mrs. Levy, do I have you still?
You do. So
Awesome.
a couple things. So before I answer your question, when I said 5% is my floor, that didn't mean 544. I am comfortable with a consistent 5. The other thing that I wanted to address briefly before I answer your question is I know you mentioned Board Member Hankins previously expressed thoughts about it, but I just don't think that's fair to build that in since he's not here and assume that there is consensus. So I'm unclear on whether our consensus is 3-year or 4-year. And then to answer your question, I don't have a priority because I think all of these things have to be done, but we definitely have to address pay of staff, we have to address academic achievement, and we have to address behaviors. And I am hopeful that we can partner with the city to also address transportation, hopefully in an amount that will be lower than what is budgeted or projected with the 500,000.
Thank you, Ms. Levy. So I'm hearing you say academic behavior, and I also heard you say the consensus space is a thought. I'm just trying to get us to a certain package for our conversation, really for tomorrow as well, but it allows me to kind of keep working to eliminate some of our, I hate to say options, but to kind of hone us in towards where we're going. But thank you for adding the academic and behavioral piece. All of it is important to you, what I'm hearing. But maybe we can do something different with the city from a transportation perspective. Mrs. Miller?
Yeah, just because I don't want to repeat anything that's been said, I'm really saying, I know that you're asking for specific priorities. I haven't heard anything I've disagreed with. I will say that obviously like academic and behavior, it's a reciprocal relationship. I think like what Mrs. Levy was saying between all three, right? You got to get kids in seats. You have to have like safe, manageable learning spaces. And of course you have to have the investment in academic support. So what I will contribute specifically is we need more people and training. And I think that the prioritization of academic and behavioral should be like needs-based by building. So like, that's kind of my cop-out way of saying I really like both. And the thing I want to contribute to with transportation, I think Board President Johnson touched on this earlier. I'd really be interested in seeing if we're able to invest more in middle school transportation. There are kids with really long bus rides because of our shift to the two schools with Frusen and Aldrich. If it's possible to allocate some of that million-ish dollars in one of those options, if that's where we choose to go, to expanding the number of routes, I think a compromise between offering busing to the high school and increasing our routes for middle school would be, to me, like kind of the sweet spot for transportation. So like, yeah, like all three, but I think like, you know, academics and behavior have to be our main investment because I do think there are hopefully potential partnership opportunities with transportation, but of course all three.
Thank you. And Mrs. Johnson?
Thank you, and thank you everyone for sharing all of the great comments, great ideas. And yeah, all of these needs are very, very important, very relevant, very real. Some of my concerns, and I thank you for giving us the weekend to reflect and listen to constituents and giving everyone time to weigh in. I know one of the scenarios included like 6 behavioral specialists and the AP back at the high school. I'm still a little bit hazy on what exactly a behavioral specialist is versus what a psychologist or a counselor or an interventionist might do or provide. And I'm wondering if our staffing, behavior, and academics, if we're trying to solve a problem with money without addressing where the problem is happening, and to what Ms. Miller just referred to, what's happening in the classroom. Would $1 million of behavioral specialists be better spent as $1 million of extra para-educators paid at a higher rate in the classrooms where the learning and behavior issues start? So that's a concern of mine. I think we need to start building back our HR department. If we're having this, the fact that staffing is such a big issue, and yes, the teacher shortage is happening everywhere, and part of the reason why we're really in a bind because we're short on money, we're short on staff. We need to do something, and I'd like to see a position returned to the HR department. I'd like to see the AP position restored at the high school. And I would like to have behavior specialists if I felt more comfortable that that was the solution. I don't know, what the solution is for the behavior. If you look at our code of conduct, we seem to have a pretty tight code of conduct, but the behaviors continue. The other issue in terms of behavior and academics that I would like to see addressed is early childhood literacy and readiness, getting the students in ready to learn when they come in as kindergartners or 4K. Not that they have to be reading at that level, but having the appropriate behaviors and ability, help working with community groups to get our young people ready for school is a concern.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Johnson. I think I'm definitely hearing you speak to academics as a space, and the behavior as a space as well, and what it actually looks like, both areas. I did ask Mrs. Beavers to address the para space. Your statement around would paras be better than behavioral specialists, and maybe even venture down the thought around when we think about behavioral specialists, again, adding another person to support our behaviors in our buildings outside of it just really landing in a few people's spaces is what we were thinking about, and that this position was something that was already done in our district. But I'm gonna let Mrs. Beavers kind of speak to that pocket of information before we kind of move forward.
I don't have a lot to say. My personal opinion is throwing bodies at the problem is not going to solve it. And in the spirit of continuous improvement, we have to look at the system. And so whatever these positions are called, my hope would be that they're doing some systems work, because we're not going to fix the kids. We have to fix our systems to support the kids as to how they're showing up to us. So I guess I would push back a little bit on paras, just because that's a Band-Aid to probably a larger problem.
Okay, so if it's the systems, then is it behavior? So as I said, I'm not certain I know what a behavioral specialist is, and would it be better to try to recruit more counselors or psychologists or social workers? Well, what is your opinion, your professional opinion on what would help fix our system?
Yep. I personally think that we need to give teachers more tools to manage their classrooms. How we go about doing that through professional learning, through whatever these positions, behavior specialists, I'm not sure that I have the answer right here tonight, but I can certainly think about that and get back to you.
Can you explain the different, what is a behavior specialist? And I heard Dr. Garrison say that the district has had them in the past. I don't think during any time that I've been on the board that we had behavior specialists, so
Yeah.
it's something I'm personally unfamiliar with.
I mean, I think you could call them behavior interventionists, and they'd be the same thing. So just like you have an academic interventionist, this would be similar to supporting behavior. I don't know if that helps.
Okay, thank you.
Working through the tiered interventions. Like typically when a student cannot read, we intervene and we give them additional help and we support them through the tiered interventions. In behavior, we usually just exclude them and we don't teach them the tools they need to be supported in the classroom. So really looking at that multi-level systems of support and how we can support them in learning appropriate behavior and giving teachers the tools. So to me, it would be a 50-50, like you're working with students, but you're also working with the adults in the building. It's
Okay.
just my personal opinion.
That's
Okay,
what we.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you. Ms. Miller?
Thank you so much. I just wanted to just kind of react to two things you said that I thought were awesome. One, with regards to the early literacy intervention, I used to work in a grant with the library, and it still exists, and it's fantastic. It was a Play and Read grant, but it's now called ABC Playgroup. It stands for All Below Children Playgroup. The library has done a fabulous job of sustaining the program, and the entire purpose of that was a partnership between DPI, the Arrowhead Library System, and and AmeriCorps, to provide early literacy and kind of kindergarten readiness to 3 and 4 year olds. And so this is a program that still exists. One of the members of our finance ad hoc committee was one of our volunteers, and this is a program that used to be in our schools. And so this is absolutely something that we could engage in partnership with. So I just want to put that out there and just kind of, contribute to what you said. Also with, I just wanted to kind of, in addition to what Ms. Beaver shared, just to kind of help, because I know it's hard when you're not in the classrooms and stuff. So with behavior, whether it's intervention or specialists, that could be something you need that extra grown up to come and you've got your caseload of kids, and maybe you've got a check-in, check-out system, which, special education teachers' caseloads are overflowing. Just because a child has a behavior issue also doesn't necessarily mean that they have an IEP, right? So they might not be able to get those services. So being that person to say, here's my caseload of kids who have some additional needs, and I really want them to be successful, keep kids in seats, keep them learning and contributing positively to that learning environment, right? And so having said that, that could be hey, I'm your safe person. We've built this relationship. What are we going to do in class today if we're feeling chucking that pencil at that kid, or whatever it is. It could be stuff like that. Kids who get dysregulated, we do have a great code of conduct. Of course, there's always stuff we could build on it, right? But having, that's only one half of the equation, right? Because people do impulsive stuff, especially teenagers, right? And so having a person and a place for a child to go to makes teaching spaces, right, safer. You can, okay, Megan, you're having a rough day. Let's go see Miss or Mr. So-and-so. You get to keep teaching. That child gets to get hopefully regulated, get back to class and learn some things, right? And so, I think that's just my lived experience as a teacher, how I've appreciated my colleagues doing that work, how I've done that work like that in the past too, and it's really powerful. So it's something that I just I really want to support. I really am hopeful that in this referendum we can make that one of our priorities, because it just does amazing stuff, not only for kids, but for the culture of the building as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Greg Schneider? Oh, I thought I saw your hand up.
It was. I took it down because Megan was saying the same thing.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
So, what I'm hearing is, again, just based off of the snapshots, we definitely want to see some form of behavioral conversations in there and what that actually looks like. We mentioned, of course, the behavioral supports as a space, as well as, some of the other spaces as a way to help with the conversation. We can definitely do that. It doesn't have to be an all-in package. What I mean by that is, from a numbers perspective, I know we talked about a 3-year total being about $1.8 million, which is overall, roughly, divide that by $600,000 a year in a nutshell. 6, 12, 18, yeah. And so that's what that behavioral package would look like. Academically, we talked about literacy and math being the space, and I know.
Dr. Garrison,
sure.
can you project that for us?
Oh, sure. I'm thinking y'all looking at the same thing. Let me do this real quick. And so, and just for those who follow along with it, this is something that's in the board docs as well, just in case. So the academics and behavioral support costs, the packages that we have here, please note that any form of these packages we could do from academic space and from our behavioral space. And it may not be the all-in $1.8 million. It may not be the all-in $1.6 million, but we could actually do something in both. So that's just a space that I wanted to kind of bring note to. So academics and behaviorals, what I'm hearing is something that's very important. The transportation, we would have to look at, no one necessarily from a consistency perspective said that this has to be in the conversation, but maybe and just hear me out, in some of the surpluses that we get naturally over time with some of the natural attrition spaces that we have. People retire. Those conversations that we can look at a bucket of funds to support that. Mrs. Johnson, you also mentioned early childhood conversation that 0 to 3 possible space there. I would love to do everything. I would love for all that to kind of roll into a space. However, these all comes with additional cost that was not built into necessarily built into the conversation from January the 9th, and I want to make sure that I honor that thought. But it doesn't mean that we can't still have conversations in it when we have a surplus in these buckets of money when we lay out the 5 for possibility. With that being stated, Mr. Chady, I think from a funding perspective, we're looking at a 5-4-4, possibly a 3-year. I say possibly a 3-year based off of the conversations now into tomorrow. And then a package that includes behavior and academics. My goal is, again, to kind of, like I mentioned, to kind of get us to a space where we are kind of landing so that tomorrow or even today we can say, you know what, let's hone in on what we really mean around academics and our behavior. We can do that today as well. But we do need to, of course, get to that, closer to that space in which we're landing. Mr. Chady, can you tell us what that 5-4-4 could look like with not necessarily with a package right now, but just with that 5-4-4?
Yeah, give me 2 minutes.
Okay. So we can actually play a game. No, just playing. Just joking. No. But that's just food for thought.
So I'm going to repeat one of my concerns, and that is we are moving in a forward direction. We understand we need more people. Do we have the current staff to go out and recruit and find people?
Great question. Our current staff will consist of all of our hiring managers. So that'll include all of the principals, of course, HR, naturally, all of the directors. All of us are involved in trying to recruit in those spaces. Now, realistically, putting this out there to the public with a said salary could possibly attract people, and naturally it couldn't as well. It could be some people that be like, I really want to get paid more if I'm going to be a behavioral person in the building. We did build in, like Mrs. Almendaris mentioned, the base of about $50,000 for those positions, with bennies included in that in those scenarios, in our scenarios here. So that's the space that we'll be working from. I do think we'll be able to put something out. I do think we'll have some people that will jump into the page. How many people will jump into the conversation is yet to be determined, because naturally we haven't put it out yet.
At some point, and while Bob is doing his calculations, at some point I would like for the board to receive a report on the positions that we are using contracted services for. Like how many, what positions, and how much we are spending for outside recruiting firms to find people for us.
To recap, you want in the future a possible report around contracted services and the positions, how much we're spending in the contracted services? Okay. All right.
Any board members have any questions or comments while we are waiting? Mr. Anderson.
I would just say that I think, we identify academics and behavior. I think that, like Board Member Miller said, they kind of go hand in hand. And I think as we get our arms around behavior in the classroom, I think that feeds into additional academic achievement. So it's not necessarily a duplicative spend in each bucket to achieve the same result, because it will have, one does have effect on the other. So I'll just throw that out.
Thank you, Mr. Chady.
Put it in the chat, I think, for the meeting. If
Dr. Garrison?
Thank you. So one of the things that I like about any of these scenarios is the opportunities for it that we can still grow from these spaces. I think it's very important to note that the goal of every district is to, of course, not only just balance its budget, but to have a surplus at the end of each year, right? And I think, again, this referendum, when we move forward, allows us to have these growth conversations from a year-to-year perspective, knowing that there's going to be some form of possible surplus coming back to us that that will naturally happen in our school district, along with what you see here on the projected estimated values. So I just want to make sure we note that too. I know, again, the goal is to try to get everything, but we have to be mindful that that may not be a space or possibility for us. And I'm confident that my district will be able to address, and our district will be able to address the spaces around behavioral, spaces around transportation, the spaces around academics, with the support that this could provide. So what Mr. Chady provided for us, and the link will be shared. Could you project this, Mr. Chady, by chance? Okay. All right, let's just do that everybody can see it at the same time. I did stop sharing. So what Mr. Chady just provided for us was a snapshot of that 544, scenario H, with the new stuff, everything. And then a scenario H1, which was a subpart of scenario H, that gave us the 544 space. And then a scenario H2 that gave us a straight 5 space across the board, and what that actually looked like in projected savings. When I say savings, projected surplus. And so I'll allow Mr. Chady to kind of walk us through those numbers and what we're actually looking at as a team.
Yeah, so Board Member Miller, Board Member Levy, I put this document linked in the chat, so if you want to access it, if you've got a printer or something nearby. Otherwise, we've got it presented on the screen as well. So scenario H at the very top. Boy, can I make that a little bit bigger? I can't figure out how to do that. Anyway, so scenario H at the top was the same scenario that we looked at previously. I did insert in there the 3% to reflect the salary, wage, personnel cost increases that were being utilized. Scenario H1, approximately that $7.50 mill rate, it grosses at $7.53, and it uses 5% increase in personnel costs in the 25-26 school year, followed by 4% in 26-27, 27-28. And then it also has the additional $1,669,000, which was that additional combination of that additional supports for behavioral support and BMHS transportation. I just left the descriptors as to how the money was going to be used off the table because we could prioritize that in any fashion, honestly. And then just to satisfy my own, I did scenario H2, which is the same scenario, just it utilizes that 5% adjustment for compensation, personnel costs in each of the 3 years. So you can see when you're looking at the projected surplus deficit, scenario H1 has a projected surplus just shy of 2.7 million. Scenario H2 has a projected surplus just over 1.6 million over the course of the 3 years.
Dr. Garrison?
Thank you. So, thank you, Mr. Chady, for providing that snapshot and overview. You know, the 544, you guys see the mill rate being the 753. What I didn't do is have a general conversation with the floor and the ceiling in that space. But I do believe that, you know, as we, you know, kind of work through these scenarios, that the mill rate, if you focus on that, it could be definitely lower in all of those spaces. And so, Mr. Nichols, you mentioned the possibilities of a 644 consensus. Well, I shouldn't say consensus, but the numbers of a 544 was presented, and also that 555. The savings are, you know, very clear here, 2.6 and 1.6 million. So, board, going back to this space again, that $1.66 million of new and additional could be again in that package conversation, going back to some of Mrs. Johnson's thoughts of what, how much, and what we could put towards behavioral and academics. So, board, you have another a snapshot at, you know, something like this.
If I can interject real quick, I just discovered in scenario H2,
okay.
line out that projected surplus deficit in the 28-29 school year.
Line out? Okay.
Yeah, my bad. And I'll give you the new number. I forgot to update that. The new value would be $20,195,415. $20,195,415. That would be the deficit value in 28-29 with scenario H2. My apologies for that.
Thank you. Ms. Miller?
Thanks. I just also didn't want to lose the thought. Thank you so much for this, Mr. Chady. That $7.53 number is $3.09 more than the state is going to charge us next year for property taxes, which would yield nothing, which, you know, keeps us in a bad spot. So for $3.09 more, right, all this could be ours. So I really like all three scenarios. I want to hear from everybody else, though, before I weigh in on which one. Thanks.
Mr. Nichols?
Thank you. Okay, how do we, you lost me when you came back with $1,669,000. I thought we were talking approximately $1 million. So how did we get to 1.669?
Scenario H always had that 1,669,000 value built into it.
Okay.
Yep.
I didn't realize it was that much. I
Yeah.
thought it was around $1 million. I thought.
No.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Well, I personally believe that if we can stay around that 715 mill rate gross, I think we're close. I think we're more likely to get that, be successful with that. I know that it may not seem a lot, but 753 is 70% above that 444 if we did nothing for next year. So that's a huge jump for the average homeowner here in Beloit. So I think if we could stay around the 715 number, we would be better served come election day. Just that's my feedback.
Any other board members? Dr. Garrison?
Well, that's the difficulty that we're working from. Again, if the mill rate, to go from the 715-ish number to the 753 number, takes us back towards the package in which we're trying to build for our community and of course for the staff. When you all, of course the board wants to give more in the salary compensations, that also impacts the mill rate, naturally. And that's the hard part about, kind of what we're doing, and trying to, get as close to what the board would like to see based off of the conversations here, all the while understanding that any change that you make in these types of conversations will definitely impact our overall mill rate. So that 5% does impact that 753. You betcha it does, and so forth. The 4 and the 4. We built the district built the 3% because of where we left off in previous conversations. Okay, that's the only reason why we built the 3% as a board, and of course internally as a space to honor here in the school district. Hearing from you all, we want to do more, but understand it's going to impact that mill rate. And there's nothing we can do around that outside of not doing some of the other things. Okay? And if that be the case, board, that's how this activity and this conversation becomes much more difficult for us to keep, trying to hone in on what that would look like. And so, Mr. Nichols, you are correct. It does, that 715 was a good space. Again, if we land in that space, great. If we want to do more for our staffs and add the other packages, then we need to be able to go out as a team and naturally support this space if that's where we want to land. And that's my sentiment. Maybe we can bring back another scenario that allows, maybe, like I said, going back to the page even. We did have in the original document today that 4% space, but that's not what a board is. And that kept us around that 715 number. Again, me and Mr. Chater had tons of conversations around what that actually could look like and sound like and come back with. But that 3% is also something that we built in to keep us around that 715 number, but that's a lower number. So we would love to give the staff what you all are proposing here, but that does come with the additional mill rate space unless we take off other themes. Okay? So that's something the board would have to help me decide.
Thank you. Brian Nichols?
Thank you. I want to clarify, I'm not against the wage increase at all, the 5%. I'm good with 555 or 544. I'm good with either one of those, absolutely. I was just questioning the extra money was more than I thought we were talking about. So my mistake for assuming that. So anyway, but the other part of my conversation I stand on. Thank you.
Brian Anderson?
Yeah, I like the conversation on that mill rate, and Mr. Shady did a good job earlier of saying, I think a 750 mill rate is not inappropriate. Lower means just less services, right? But I think that 753 in this scenario H1, as he pointed out, is still pretty conservative. The way it's calculated, right? And so I think I'd rather see that 753 and then be able to say, yeah, but it likely could come in less than that based on equalized value and it's kind of a best guess, but I don't want to surprise you the other direction because we don't want that 2 years from now either. So I think likely could be lower. I think a 7.5 mill rate puts us in good standing within the rest of the state and still allows room for, what may or may not come next. Again, back to that capital conversation.
Thank you. Greg Schneider?
I guess I like scenario, I'd like to go with scenario H2, but I think that kind of restricts us quite a bit on some of the other things that we can do as an option. So I would prefer to go with H1, knowing that we have in the second and third year that 4% there for personnel costs. Doesn't mean that we can't increase it at that time, but at least we know we have that amount that we can go forward with. And again, this does allow us to do part of what the community is asking us to do. And I think that should be part of the driving force that we need here. We know where we need to go, but we have to also meet some of the things that the community is asking us to do. And I think H1 is going to give us that best opportunity to do that.
Thank you. Any other board members?
Can I ask a question real quick? Yeah, Mr. Chady, H1 and H, you know, H at the top, again, gave us the two snapshots in behavior and transportation. Again, we can switch that stuff around and it can be looks completely different. What I'm hearing from the board, again, is we want to pay our staff. And so that's consistent across the board. We all want to pay the staff. Do you think a package of would the board be amenable to a package of 533? Now, again, that's not what I don't think you all want to do, but if you want to drive if we take away the supports, my apologies, if we take away the supports and then do 544, let's say we go lower in the support area, would that change the mill rate much?
It really won't change the mill rate any. What it will do is it'll change your projected surplus deficit line items.
Okay.
So
the 544, let's say we did, instead of the 1.6, we did minus 600,000. Let's say we just did $1 million and something. Would that lower the mill rate?
no, it really won't lower the mill rate at all either. That'll just go back to adjusting the projected surplus and deficit line items.
Thank you.
With regards to the mill rate, I think we're right in trying to focus on that from a stability standpoint for both what the property taxpayers would be asked to pay over the next 3 years and what those additional revenues that it'll generate to the district are. And again, that mill rate's kind of the top end of the mill rate. I could see it coming in closer to 7 plus or minus maybe a dime either way. And again, a number of factors will determine that. When it comes to actually writing the question, we can't write the question based on a mill rate. So we have to write the question based on a dollar value. And I just want to point out in scenario H1 and scenario H2, if you look at the non-recurring referendum amounts, especially in that 25-26 year, so I kind of rounded up to 9,170,000 in scenario H2, still ended up at that 753 mill rate. And then you can see the adjustments in years 2 and years 3 as well, just trying to round the values to a more reasonable number, or not as a specific number, just $16,950,000 as compared to $16,719,750. So just something for us to think about is the actual, as much as we're approaching it from a mill rate perspective, we need to kind of roll back then to that top row, the non-recurring referendum amounts. And once the board is comfortable where you're at, I guess I would seek the flexibility from the board to refine that non-recurring referendum amount a little bit so as to not exceed the mill rate, but perhaps to turn that into a easier figure to utilize and explain.
So there's a lot of shifting that we're talking about right now, and I need to, kind of bring us back to where we're trying to go for even yet tomorrow. Mrs. Johnson, what's your thoughts?
I see Mrs. Levy has her hand up.
Thank you, and I apologize if this was already covered when I had to step away. If I'm understanding the compensation allocation correctly, are we saying when we're talking about percentages like 555 or 544, that is for compensation increases and potential new positions? And then when we talk about money allocated for behavioral support, that could also include new positions. Are we potentially double dipping, or how has the discussion been when I stepped away about allocations in these two different buckets?
So we're not double dipping. So the 544 is, of course, the salary increases, and then we then we talked about $1.6 million conversation and then a new additional supports. And so when we say new additional supports, that's still landing in the area of academics and behavior. And so it wouldn't be the total packages that we presented, but a portion of both packages in academics and in behavior.
So just so I'm clear, the percentage of compensation increases is for current staff increases only. And when we talk about behavioral support, that would include new positions. Is that accurate?
That is accurate, as well as new opportunities in academics. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
No problem. And so, again, I want to get us back to, moving towards not necessarily just a consensus space, but trying to get together with a package. So what I'm hearing from the board is we would like to be in between the 7 and the 750, preferably closer to that 715. Well, not necessarily preferably, but that's the statement that Mr. Nichols made. We would like the flexibility to think about the total. And the total right now is, as we're landing, is in that $40 million request, okay? In that $40 million request, in either scenarios, H1 or H2, is bringing us at that 753. The difference in H is that that's giving us only that 3% increase across the board versus the 544. And that's what the change in the $2 million or so has done, okay? So board, I think I do have enough information right now to kind of bring us to a space. From what I'm hearing is we want something in behavioral and academics. We want to continue with the 5, and consensus is landing closer to that 544, minus Mr. Hankins weighing in. The 3 or the 4 year conversation, based off of who's in the room right now, is still the 3 year as a sentiment, non-reoccurring. And I think we kind of got to go from there, board.
Any other questions or comments? Brian Nichols.
Thank you, Board President Johnson. Okay, this is driving me nuts. So in H, at 3%, without any addition, our second year referendum amount went from, in H, it was at 13,419, 750. Okay, so we added 4%, which, as you said earlier, is about $1 million every time we go up 1%, or $1 million when we go down. So that works. But then we go down to 5% in H2, and it's almost identically the same as it is in 27, 28. How does that work? I know we added the 1.66 million, right?
Right. Yep.
Brian, do you
So-
mean, if I can ask,
Yes.
do you mean in 27, 28, or do you mean in H2 as compared to H1?
In H1 and H2. Well, I started out at H because of it jumped $1 million partly because of the salary increase from 3 to 4. But if you go from H1 to H2, the second year and third years are almost identically the same, with a 1% with a 1% increase in the salary each year.
So we have to go back to the basics.
Okay.
And we're going to go back to the revenue limit.
Okay.
So the revenue limit is driven by two things. I mean, that's essentially what we're trying to solve here is the revenue limit
Right.
and the limitations therein. So the revenue limit is comprised of essentially your local property tax
Right.
and your equalization aid.
Okay.
Equalization aid, one of the key factors in equalization aid is how much you spent in the prior year. So your prior year spending. So within the formula, as we are increasing expenses, the equalization aid is being positively impacted. Now that either means we get a little bit more equalization aid or it minimizes our loss.
Okay.
So as that equalization aid amount within the budget model changes, then that provides more flexibility within the property taxes, which is driven primarily by trying to hit this mill rate target. So on one of the notations of the original document for today, and I think we spoke about this last week, Thursday, that every $1 million in the referendum authority is about 34 cents in the mill rate. Every $100,000 is about 3.4 cents in the mill rate. So again, trying to maximize our revenue opportunity through the revenue, the non-recurring referendum amount, but yet hit these projected mill rate targets, that's where you see that fluctuation or the variance in the non-recurring referendum amount. So you would think that, okay, so if we're going from 4% in year 2 to 5% in year 2, and a 1% change was, and I got to remind myself, was about $505,000, you would think that you would see $505,000 increase in the non-recurring referendum amount, but it doesn't really work that way. I had to walk myself through this last week as well, so. Yep.
So,
Okay, well, but Bob, thank you for this, putting these together. I really do appreciate it. It makes it easier when we're getting updated information as soon as we do. So thank you.
Dr. Garrison?
yeah, so I think right now we want to honor the feedback. And I want to do one more rip around just from the board, if you all don't mind, based off of what has been given to you in the last scenario boxes that you see on the screen. I want you to decide, if you can, H, H1, or H2. I just want to kind of hear, because that's going to help us develop another possible package again tomorrow. But it also allow us to not do a possible package if we can kind of land somewhere. I know, please understand, I know we will not be able to do everything. And that was always going to be a space that we had to contend with. And so that's why I wanted to hear from you all around your top behavior of the top 3 other opportunities. Paying the staff was one of them, behavioral fund balance, and behavioral support academics. And so we clearly has heard paying the staff, academics, and behavioral support has been a space in which we want to honor. So we've clearly heard that. And so I want to rip around real quick around what you see on this last document, where you're kind of landing more, okay? And again, understanding that the 753 is something that we can play around with a little bit, me and Mr. Chady, but it probably won't move too far off of what you see here, but we can kind of play around with it a little bit, okay? So, Mr. Schneider, if you won't mind me starting with you, please.
H1,
Thank you. Mr. Nichols,
H1.
Mrs. Levy,
I'm driving, so I'm going to be the worst participant in this ever because I can't look at the new information that we have received.
okay, so we'll pause, Mrs. Levy, if that's okay, and then we'll come back. Mr. Anderson,
H1?
Mrs. Miller,
I'm at H1, and Mrs. Levy, scenario H2 is the one that's consistently 5%, 5%, 5% increase for staff.
Mrs. Johnson,
H2.
okay. Mrs. Levy, when you get a chance, just, shoot me a thought, and then we'll go from there. But I'm hearing H1, playing around with that package a little bit. Oh, Mr. Anderson, did I say you? Yeah, he said H1.
Oh, we did?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. No problem. Did I miss it? Mrs. Levy, when you get a chance, maybe you can shoot me a thought with the scenarios that we have, the most recent scenario box of H1, and H2. The major changes is in H2 is the 5% that you requested, and we kind of put that together in a snapshot package for you. And then we can kind of grow from there. Ms. Chady, do you think we have enough information to pull together?
May I interject really quickly? Just in case I can't pull the link from the chat, could Mr. Chady or someone, could you email me this updated document?
Yeah, we'll do.
I just sent it.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, perfect. So you'll get the updated document, and you can kind of let me know what your thoughts are, and we'll kind of grow from there. Mr. Che, do you think we have enough information right now? So I'm hearing 3-year based off of what's in the room. I know, Mr. Snyder, you mentioned you can go either way. Megan, you mentioned you can go either way if needed. I know, Mrs. Levy, you're still at 4, and the rest of the room was still at 3. We definitely heard academics and behavior is where we want to land, and then paying our staff was the other space, and I think that 544 is kind of where we're landing with that space. Now, if we wanted to mess with the mill rate just a little bit, 533 could do it, but that'll be a different space that you all would have that we'll probably play around with to show you all what that looks like at tomorrow's conversation. Mrs. Johnson, any thoughts for me or takeaways you want us to go back with?
Any last questions or comments from board members? Thank you, cabinet members. Thank you, board members, for coming out tonight for this special meeting, and thank you, Dr. Garrison, for putting this together. Our next item is next meeting dates. We have a meeting tomorrow night. The TLE committee meeting meets Tuesday, January 14th at 5 p.m. We have our regular board meeting tomorrow night. It's been rescheduled due to the state convention the following week, and that starts at 6 p.m. And there is a tentative board meeting to vote on the referendum Thursday, January 16th at 5 p.m. Can I get a motion for adjournment?
So moved.
second.
Motion by Brian Nichols, seconded by Greg Schneider. Any discussion? Dr. Garrison?
Sure. Just want to make sure that the board understands that we will not be necessarily voting on this tomorrow, but we will be real close to making sure that this is where we're going to land for a possible vote on Thursday. By a show of hands, who will be able to make that meeting. I don't have the doodle in front of me, so I just want to make sure that we have consensus there.
The Thursday meeting?
Yes, ma'am. Greg, you good?
I am not available for a meeting on Thursday. I thought we would be voting tomorrow.
We weren't able to vote tomorrow due to the resolution language not being able to be posted within a 24-hour time frame, which that's the space that we had to kind of work from, Mrs. Levy. So that's something that we weren't able to do. But based off of today's conversation, that did get us a lot closer to that resolution language, very close, if not right there. And then we'll be able to vote on Thursday. So just wanted to make sure everyone was aware of that change. So Mrs. Levy, thank you for letting us know that you won't be able to be at that conversation. Mr. Nichols, you said yes. Ms. Thompson, yes. Brian, yes. That meeting will probably need to be virtual due to the fact that a lot of us we'll be here. It'll be in person. We're good on the 16th. I keep doing that. I'm thinking we're ahead. Mrs. Miller, I didn't see where you will be available.
Yeah, I had my hand up. I'm good.
Okay, thank you so much. So we have a quorum. Thank you.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion carries unanimously. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.